Welcome to this deep dive. We're tackling a really striking case out of Korea that hit the news in early 2025 involving KakaoPay and a data transfer that sounds almost unbelievable in scale.
It really is. It's the kind of case that makes you pause,
Yeah.
It makes you think about your own data.
Right.
It highlights how something as seemingly simple as using a payment app can involve your most sensitive information, names, phone numbers, even like account balances being used in ways you never anticipated.
Yeah, and the sources talk about it being used to build this credit-like index, a non-financial score.
Exactly, the NSF. And that score could genuinely impact your life, influencing things like whether you get a loan or maybe even a job.
That brings it right into focus, doesn't it? This isn't abstract. It's really personal. And the sources frame it beautifully, posing a critical question. Who should we really trust with this sensitive information?
Yeah, it's a fundamental question.
They even use an analogy that, frankly, you won't forget. Would you trust a cat to guard a fish market?
Huh. Yeah, that one sticks.
It really makes you question the basic assumptions we make when we just, hand over our data.
It's a powerful way to cut through the complexity and get right to the heart of that trust issue.
Okay, so our mission in this deep dive is to unpack exactly what went down in this KakaoPay case.
Right.
Understand what it reveals about data protection laws and their limits, specifically in Korea.
And then explore some pretty fascinating ideas the sources put forward for how technology and even regular citizens could step up, maybe help protect our data better.
Exactly. Let's dig in.
Let's start with the case itself. It really came to public attention back in January 2025.
Okay.
That's when Korea's Personal Information Protection Commission, the PIPC, announced some pretty significant fines. KakaoPay was fined KRW 6 billion.
Which is roughly 5.8 million US dollars, yeah.
Hefty sum, definitely. And there was also a related fine for Apple, KRW 2.45 billion in connection.
So what specific action led to these fines? What did KakaoPay actually do?
Well, the core issue, according to the sources, was this huge unauthorized transfer of data.
Unauthorized?
Yeah. Belonging to approximately 40 million KakaoPay users. And this wasn't just like a small leak or a glitch.
Right.
It was an intentional transfer to China's Alipay.
40 million users. That's a massive number of people affected.
It is, and the scale of the data itself.
Yeah, what about the data?
Staggering. The transfer apparently happened in 3 phases, between April and July of 2018.
Okay, back in 2018.
Right, and the total number of records transferred was, get this, 5.42 billion.
5.4 billion records. What kind of information are we talking about? Was it just like anonymized user IDs or something?
No, far from it. The sources list 24 different types of sensitive personal information.
Such as?
Things like usernames, phone numbers, email addresses, and critically things like bank account balances.
Wow. Okay, so billions of records, sensitive financial and personal data, 40 million users, all went to Alipay in China. And the purpose, you mentioned earlier, was training this non-financial score model, the NSF.
Exactly. The data was explicitly used to train Alipay's NSF model.
And this NSF, explain that a bit more. It's like a credit score, but different.
Yeah. It's basically a scoring system that functions like a credit index, but uses non-financial data.
Okay.
And its significance is that it can weigh heavily on things like determining insurance premiums, approving loans, or even influencing recruitment decisions.
So, wait. Data that users shared with KakaoPay, a payment service,
Right.
was being used to build a profile that could affect their access to credit or jobs elsewhere through Alipay.
Precisely. It connects seemingly disparate pieces of personal information in a way that has real-world consequences for people.
And what happened to Alipay in all this? Were there sanctions?
Yeah, the sanctions against Alipay included in order to actually dismantle the specific NSF model that was built using this transferred data.
Okay, so they had to get rid of the model built on that data.
Yeah.
So you have this massive transfer, sensitive data, really impactful purpose, all apparently without clear user knowledge, leading to these big fines. This immediately raises questions about the law. How could this happen under Korea's Personal Information Protection Act, PIPA?
And that's where the case really hits home about the practical limitations of legal frameworks, even strong ones.
Right.
KakaoPay was found to be in violation of PIPA, specifically concerning the rules around consent.
Which rules exactly are we talking about?
Well, the core failure, according to the sources, hits squarely on Article 20 of PIPA, which requires explicit and specific user consent before sharing their data with third parties.
And in the KakaoPay,
The consent forms users clicked agree on. They just didn't mention that the data would be used to train this NSF model. Not at all.
So even though they technically got some kind of consent on paper,
Yeah, checkbox somewhere.
wasn't meaningful consent. Users agreed to something without having any idea that meant their account balance was going to China to build a credit-like score.
Exactly. As one source puts it directly, users gave consent but had no idea what they were consenting to.
That really highlights the whole problem with what people call formal consent, doesn't it?
It really does. Where the legal box is ticked, but the user's actual understanding is basically zero.
And the fact that the data went internationally to China. Does PIPA cover that specific situation?
Absolutely. PIPA has Article 28, which lays out specific requirements for cross-border data transfers.
Like what?
Well, it requires separate consent specifically for sending data overseas.
Okay, so not buried in the main term.
Right. Plus, it mandates additional protective measures be put in place for that data.
And KakaoPay.
Failed on those points, too, for the transfer to Alipay. Didn't comply.
So the legal violations weren't just some minor oversight. They went right to the heart of fundamental data protection principles. Clear consent, secure handling, especially when data leaves the country.
Exactly right. It exposed significant gaps, maybe not in the existence of the rules on paper, but certainly in how they were applied or maybe enforced in this instance.
That leads us naturally to look at the structure of PIPA itself then. Beyond just this specific case, do the sources point to deeper issues with the law or how it's implemented in Korea?
They do, yeah. While PIPA has some robust provisions covering consent, like we said, cross-border transfers, and even requiring data protection impact assessments, or DTIAs, for high-risk processing.
Okay, DPIAs. We should talk about those.
We should. But yeah, despite these provisions, there are criticisms about how they actually operate in practice.
It's worth noting, though, Korea has been trying to strengthen PIPA recently, right? There were amendments.
Yes, that's important context. There was a major revision in 2023,
Right.
aiming for this principle of same activity, same regulation, trying to remove some old exemptions for online services.
Right, leveling the playing field.
And then a 2024 presidential decree added things like the right to explanation for automated decisions.
Like for the NSF score, potentially?
Potentially, yes. And stricter chief privacy officer qualifications, mandatory data breach insurance. So there's definitely a move towards stronger protection on paper.
Okay, so improvements are being made. Yet the sources still highlight a major structural weakness, particularly around those DPIAs you mentioned, the impact assessments.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most critical point the sources make about the system itself. These DPIAs, which are supposed to evaluate the risks for high-risk data processing activities, are internally authored by the companies themselves.
Wait, the company doing the processing writes its own risk assessment.
That's the standard procedure. And here's the key flaw the sources point out. These reports are not required to be made public.
Okay. So the company planning the potentially risky data use is also the one writing the report assessing its safety, and they don't have to show it to anyone external, like the public or regulators.
Precisely. And you can see the problem there, right? What's striking here is the lack of transparency this creates.
Yeah, huge lack of transparency.
It leaves significant room for companies to potentially, downplay risks or maybe evade full responsibility because there's no independent public check on their assessment.
That sounds exactly like the cat guarding the fish market scenario we talked about right at the start.
That analogy is used in the source material specifically to describe this structure, the self-authored, non-public DPIA system.
You're trusting the entity that benefits from using the data to grade its own homework on privacy in secret.
Pretty much. And it's a structural issue that's been criticized by external observers, too. Like the law firm DLA Piper specifically pointed to the non-disclosure of DPI reports as a major lack of transparency.
And the PIPC's role, the regulator, does their enforcement counteract this lack of transparency?
Well, the criticism highlighted in the sources is that the PIPC's enforcement tends to focus more on penalties after a violation occurs, like we saw with the KakaoPay fines.
Reactive, not proactive.
Kind of, yeah. Less focus on strong proactive measures to prevent these kinds of breaches and misuses from happening in the first place, partly because they might not even see the risks outlined in those internal DPIAs.
Okay, so if companies are basically grading their own homework, and that homework isn't public, is there a way technology could maybe help? Could it bring more objectivity or transparency to that assessment process?
That's where the sources explore a really fascinating possibility using AI.
AI for DPIAs.
Yeah, the idea is that AI could potentially play a significant role in enhancing the objectivity and maybe the transparency of these data protection impact assessments.
How would that work in practice? Like, what would the AI do?
Well, you can imagine AI tools designed to automatically analyze a company's proposed data flows,
Okay.
identify potential privacy risks or compliance gaps much more consistently, perhaps, than human reviewers alone.
More systematic.
Exactly. And even help structure or auto-generate parts of the DPIA report based on objective criteria. This could lead to more standardized and maybe verifiable assessments.
Is this kind of thing happening anywhere yet? Is it just theoretical?
The concept definitely aligns with frameworks being explored elsewhere, like the privacy-aware AI approaches in Europe for GDPR compliance.
Right, assessing AI systems for privacy.
Yes, and also using tech in the assessment. And the sources do mention some commercial tools that are starting to integrate AI into privacy management.
Oh, really? Like what?
They point to companies like Catch, which apparently uses AI for recommendations within assessments, or Security and Clarip, who market AI-driven capabilities for automating parts of the DPIA and privacy compliance process.
Okay, so tools are starting to use AI to help assist with these privacy tasks.
Right.
But are they full independent AI systems designed specifically to, say, verify a company's DPIA report for objectivity and transparency? Could the PIPC use one to check a company's report?
That's a really crucial distinction the sources make. The current state of these tools seems often focused on automator support functions.
Okay.
Helping companies find risks, map their data, fill out the forms more efficiently, that kind of thing.
But not acting as an independent auditor.
Generally, no. They aren't typically designed right now as standalone engines that can independently audit and verify the entire DPIA report's accuracy and objectivity in a way that provides, say, public transparency. And the transparency of the AI within these tools can also vary a lot.
So the potential is there, and maybe research is happening.
Exactly. There's research focusing on both doing DPIAs for AI systems, which is important in itself, and crucially for this discussion, on integrating AI into the DPIA process to make it more robust, more objective.
Laying the groundwork.
Right. So while current tools might be limited as dedicated verification engines, the potential for AI to improve efficiency, comprehensiveness, and importantly, objectivity in DPIAs is pretty significant. We can probably expect more sophisticated tools as the technology develops and maybe regulatory demands increase.
Okay, so tech like AI offers one potential piece of the puzzle, maybe helping with verification down the line. But what about the human element? Can ordinary citizens play a meaningful role in protecting data beyond just, clicking agree and hoping companies do the right thing, or regulators eventually catch violations?
The sources strongly emphasize that citizen oversight is absolutely indispensable for effective privacy protection. It's not just a nice to have.
How does that fit into the broader conversation about privacy? Is this a common theme?
It really connects to the growing recognition that relying solely on individuals giving consent, which, as we saw, clearly failed in the KakaoPay case, just isn't sufficient.
Right, the consent fatigue problem, too.
Exactly. Organizations like the Future of Privacy Forum have highlighted this, pushing for more risk-based approaches and explicitly calling for increasing civic engagement.
Okay.
And you see studies on governance, especially in complex data environments like smart cities, also supporting this move towards more citizen-centered models.
So bringing it back to the specific case we're dissecting, how did this massive KakaoPay data transfer even come to light in the first place? Was it discovered by the PIPC during a routine audit, or?
No. And this is perhaps the most powerful point demonstrating the real value of citizen involvement. What's truly fascinating here, according to the sources, is that the entire KakaoPay investigation was initiated by a report from a citizen group.
Get out. You mean a group of regular people or activists filed a report?
Seems so. That report is what triggered the police investigation, which then ultimately led to the PIPC fines and the actions we've been discussing.
Wow. So the case itself, the very one that exposed these fundamental flaws in the system, the consent issues, the cross-border problems, the DPIA weakness, was brought forward by citizens noticing something wasn't right.
Exactly. It's not just a theoretical idea about civic engagement. It's a concrete, high-profile example of how incredibly effective civic monitoring can be.
Holding powerful entities accountable.
Right. Uncovering significant data privacy violations that might otherwise just remain hidden from view.
Okay, so what does this all mean then? The KakaoPay case wasn't just an isolated incident, clearly. It exposed these systemic vulnerabilities in how data is handled and protected, particularly the limits of relying on companies to regulate themselves through things like non-public DPIAs. And the sources, they aren't just diagnosing the problem, they're actually proposing a way forward.
They are. A path forward that deliberately tries to combine the potential of that AI verification we talked about with the proven power of civic oversight we just discussed.
Dual approach.
Exactly. They lay out several specific institutional reform proposals aimed at building what they're called data democracy.
Okay, like what are the proposals?
Well, first, to tackle that self-assessment problem with DPIAs, they propose the introduction of AI-based DPIA verification.
Right, using AI as a check.
Yeah. Led by the PIPC, using AI tools to add an independent layer of scrutiny, checking the objectivity of those company-submitted reports.
Putting a check on the cat guarding the fish market, maybe with a robot assistant?
Yeah, something like that. And building on that, they propose mandating DPIA transparency.
Making them public?
Requiring companies to publish at least public summaries of their privacy assessments, and also setting up independent review committees that actually include external experts and citizens.
Okay, letting some sunlight in. What about giving users more direct control or visibility over their data's movement?
Good question. There's a proposal to establish a right to data location APIs.
Data location APIs, what does that mean?
It would basically expand existing data portability rights. It would mandate companies provide technical interfaces APIs that allow users to track where their data is actually being stored and how it moves between different systems or third parties.
So you could see a map of where your information is residing or where it's been sent.
That's the general idea, providing the technical means for much greater user visibility and potentially control over data flows.
Interesting. What else?
They also propose to strengthen explanations for automated decisions.
Back to the NSF score idea.
Exactly. Requiring clear, understandable explanations for decisions made by systems like that, with real penalties if companies fail to provide them.
Making those algorithmic black boxes a little less opaque.
Right. And really leaning into that citizen power we saw was so effective in the KakaoPay case, they proposed to institutionalize public citizen auditing teams.
Formalizing citizen audits.
Yeah, essentially legalizing and structuring citizen-led audits. These would involve civil society groups, maybe academics, other professionals, giving them the power to directly inspect corporate data processing practices.
Wow, giving citizen oversight real teeth, not just relying on whistleblowers or reports after the damage is done.
That seems to be the goal. And finally, to make the lawmaking process itself more responsive and democratic.
Yeah.
They propose to democratize the PIPA revision process. This would mean mandating public hearings and formally including consumer advocacy groups and ordinary citizens in the legislative procedures whenever PIPA is being updated.
So involving the people whose data is being regulated in the actual regulation process.
Makes sense, right?
It does. Wow. We've really gone deep into this KakaoPay case. We've unpacked what it reveals about data protection in Korea, the critical flaws in just relying on formal consent and corporate self-regulation.
And the challenges companies face, too, in handling our sensitive data responsibly.
Absolutely. The sources make a very clear case, I think. While PIPA provides a legal foundation, the KakaoPay incident really shows that without real independent oversight and active citizen participation, those protections can feel, well, insufficient. Hollow, almost.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the path forward they outline, combining the promise of technology like AI helping verify assessments,
Right.
with the proven power of civic monitoring, which was so dramatically demonstrated by the very case that brought all of this to light. It's compelling.
It really is. It's a vision of moving beyond just passively clicking agree on opaque processes and towards actively building what they're calling data democracy through more transparency, independent verification, and genuine collaboration between experts, regulators, and the public.
A very different model.
It is. So here's a final thought for you listening. If a single citizen report was powerful enough to uncover something as massive and impactful as the KakaoPay data transfer billions of records used for a hidden credit-like score, what else might be happening with your data right now that you don't know about? And maybe more importantly, what role could you potentially play in demanding more transparency and control over the information that is increasingly shaping your life? Something to think about.